Once again, it is Saturday morning cartoons. Welcome, boys and girls. Uh, I'm continuing this morning with something out of the equinox of the gods. We're sort of preparing for the Thelemic holy days, which correspond to most all great religions' holy days too. But anyway, coming right up on March 20th here pretty soon, which is the celebration of the uh, supreme invocation of Horus, which in 1904, which kicked off the change of the aeon, literally the equinox of the gods. And we're reading the section. I want you to take a look at this. Now, you may think that that is a stupid thing to do with a very nice old book. Put a big thing like that in the back of it. It looks like it's so awkward and everything. And it looks like this. There's an envelope that's attached to the inside of the back cover of this edition of the Equinox of the God. And inside that envelope are the folded sheets of paper that contain the photographic reproduction of the handwritten copy, page by page, of Liber Vel Legis, the Book of the Law. Pretty cool, and it's even got like a wooden spacer thing there. It is quite a volume. And there's also this wonderful in Crowley's handwritten version of the Hebrew, various Kabbalistic letters and their numeration and words that found in the Book of the Law, things like that. Very cool. But yesterday we read from chapter 1 of Genesis Libri Al, which the equinox of the god was Crowley's attempt to give a background of the events and the circumstances surrounding the reception of the Book of the Law. And he starts the whole thing off with talking about his own life and what brought him to that point. And it is arguably not an objective autobiography, but a very subjective autobiography of the events and the circumstances of Crowley's boyhood and adolescence and such. And he's going to bring it right up to his experience in Cairo in 1904. But before we get to that, he's going to scoot over from his birth to what we're going to start with today. These are just tiny chapters here. Chapter 2 is called Adolescence, the Beginning of Magic, the Birth of Frater Perdurabo. 0 equals 0. He's talking about grades. At first, Golden Dawn grades. And later, when he goes off on his own AA grades. But 0 equals 0. To 4 equals 7, the birth of Perdurabo. Having won freedom, he had the sense not to waste any time enjoying it. This is yesterday, sort of covered the time period of his youth, which was a combination of privileged education mixed with a traumatic religious, oppressive environment. And now he's in college and discovering things like other books besides the Bible. Having won freedom, he had the sense not to waste any time enjoying it. He had been deprived of all English literature but the Bible during the whole of his youth, and he spent his 3 years at Cambridge in repairing the defect. He was also working for the diplomatic service. The late Lord Salisbury and the late Lord Ritchie, having taken an interest in his career and given him nominations. I got to digress here for a second. There's a marvelous book that came out in the last 10 years, I believe, by the author is named Spencer. Now, the author specializes in stories, biographical stories of the British intelligence service, which for many years, from Queen Victoria on, was under the auspices of the diplomatic corps. And then it later turned into OSI or MI4, MI5, spies. Okay. And even during Crowley's time, British spies weren't professionals in the way that we think of it now with the James Bond kind of thing, but they were amateurs. They were self-sufficient, wealthy, usually upper crust amateurs who did it for the sake of their own patriotic, in some cases, amusement. And Spencer, or is it Spence? I apologize. Look up a book called Riley Ace of Spies, which became a PBS Masterpiece Theater series starring, or look up Secret Agent 666. Okay, that's his latest book. And Crowley was in Cambridge, and this one sentence here, he was also working for the diplomatic service. The late Lord Salisbury and the late Lord Ritchie having taken an interest in his career and given him nominations. Lord Salisbury was Prime Minister of England 3 times. And I haven't found much on Lord Ritchie, but perhaps you can look it up. Crowley was recruited by what was the British intelligence service to work on their behalf, not so much as a didn't have to be a spy in cloak and dagger type thing, but to be an agent, if you will, and to run small errands, like they sent him to Russia. This is all before magical stuff, okay? So when you hear that Crowley was a traitor, or Crowley was an admirer of Hitler, or that Crowley was a traitor to England and did propaganda for Germany and things like that, keep in mind that he'd been working on behalf of England's Secret Service for years before World War I, which he helped bring the United States into the war on England's side, and in World War II. When he died, he had folded up in his wallet a personal letter from the head of the then British Secret Service, or I think it was MI5 by then, a personal letter requesting the pleasure of his company for a consultation on such and such a date, kind of thing. Crowley was an interesting guy, but I digress. Okay. He was also working for the diplomatic service. The late Lord Salisbury and the late Lord Ritchie having taken an interest in his career and given him nominations. In October 1897, he was suddenly recalled to his understanding of the evils of the alleged existing religion, and experienced a trance in which he perceived the utter folly of all human ambition. The fame of an ambassador, can you imagine Crowley being an ambassador? He's such a diplomatic guy. The fame of an ambassador rarely outlives a century, and that of a poet is almost as ephemeral. The earth must one day perish. He must build in some material more lasting. This conception drove him to the study of alchemy and magic. He wrote to the author of the Book of Black Magic and Pacts, a pompous American named Arthur Waite, notorious for the affectations and obscurities of his style and the mealy-mouthed muddle of his mysticism. I told you he's not being very objective here. Okay. This nebulous impresario presenting an asthmatic Isis in the opera Bullfrogs had hinted in his preface that he knew certain occult sanctuaries wherein truth and wisdom were jealously guarded by a body of initiates to be dispensed to the postulant who proved himself worthy to partake of their privileges. Mr. Waite recommended him to read a book called The Cloud on the Sanctuary. His taste for mountaineering had become a powerful passion, and he was climbing in Cumberland where he met Oscar Eckenstein, Eckenstein, Eckenstein. It's an important name in Crowley's magical career. In a sense, it was his mental discipline guru. Oscar Eckenstein, perhaps the greatest of all mountaineers of his period, with whom he was destined to climb thenceforth until 1902. In the summer, a party was formed to camp on the, and again, excuse my pronunciation, Schönbuhl Glacier at the foot of Dent Blanc, with a view to an expedition to the Himalayas later on. During his weeks on the glacier, where the bad weather was continuous, he studied assiduously the translation by S.L. Mathers of 3 books which form the part of von Rosenroth's Kabbalah Unveiled. Those were sections of the Zohar. On one of his descents to Zermatt, he met a distinguished chemist, Julian L. Baker, who had studied alchemy. He hunted this clue through the valley and made Baker promise to meet him in London at the end of the season and introduce him to others who were interested in occult science. This happened in September. Through Baker, he met another chemist named George Cecil Jones, who introduced him to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He made rapid progress in this order, and in the spring of 1900 was its chief in England. Now that's a pretty sweeping statement. And of course, you know there's volumes of details about what transpired in that period to bring him to that simple statement. He made rapid progress in the order, and in the spring of 1900 was its chief in England. And he sort of slides out of that. The details of this period must be studied in the Temple of Solomon the King. That's in the Equinox, where a painfully full account of the order is given. In the order, he met one Alan Bennett, Frater Iai Our. I'll spell that. Is I-A, okay, is how we'll know him. Ieiaour. Is that Let There Be Light? I'm not sure, okay, at the moment. I knew once, but I'm old now. Jones and Bennett were both adepts of high standing. The latter came to live with him, or Alan Bennett, I.A., came to live with him. Crowley's referring to himself in third person, okay? The latter came to live with him in his flat, and together they carried out many operations of ceremonial magic. Alan Bennett was in constant ill health and went to Ceylon at the end of 1899. It was on his entry into this order that the subject of this history took the motto, Perdurabo, I will endure to the end. Now, when he says the subject of this, he's talking about himself. I will endure to the end. It's a quote from St. Paul, actually, I think, ringing in his ear. In July 1900, he went to Mexico and devoted his whole time to the continued practice of magic, which he obtained extraordinary success. Then see Equinox Volume 1, Number 3, for a condensed account of some of these. It may be here stated summarily that he invoked certain gods, goddesses, and spirits to visual appearance, learnt how to heal physical and moral diseases, how to make himself invisible, and how to obtain communications from spiritual sources, how to control other minds, etc., etc. And then, Chapter 3. Beginnings of Mysticism. The birth of Frater O.M., spelled O-U-M-H. 7 equals 4. Oscar Eckenstein, on his arrival in Mexico, where he was to climb mountains with the subject of our essay, found him in a rather despondent mood. He had attained most satisfactory results. He was able to communicate with divine forces, and operations such as those of invisibility and evocation had been mastered. Yet with all this, there was certain dissatisfaction. Success had not given him all that he had hoped for. He placed the situation before his companion, ready to clear his own mind rather to clear his own mind rather than hoping for any help, for he supposed him to be entirely ignorant of all these subjects, which he had habitually treated with dislike and contempt. Oscar didn't want to hear about all this magic shit. The judge of his surprise then, when he found in this unpromising quarter a message from the Great White Brotherhood. His companion told him to abandon all magic. The task, said Eckenstein, involved control of the mind. Yours is a wandering mind, he said. The proposition was indignantly denied. Test it, said the master. A short experiment was conclusive. It was impossible for the boy to keep his mind fixed upon a single object for even a few seconds at a time. The mind, though perfectly stable in motion, was unable to rest, just as a gyroscope falls when the flywheel slows down. The entire new course of experiments was consequently undertaken. Half an hour every morning and half an hour every evening were devoted to attempts to control the mind by the simple process of imagining a familiar object and endeavoring to keep concentrated upon it. He soon became sufficiently expert in this initial practice to proceed to concentration on regularly moving objects such as a pendulum, and ultimately on living things. A further series of experiments dealt with other senses. He tried to imagine and retain the taste of chocolate or of quinine, the smell of various familiar perfumes, the sound of bells, waterfalls, and so on, or feeling excited by such objects as velvet, silk, fur, sand, and steel. In the spring of 1901, he left Mexico, went to San Francisco, Honolulu, Japan, China, and Ceylon, always continuing these experiments. Now I have to pause and ask you to consider with me, what's this guy? Yes, his family was wealthy. Yes, he had. But what's he doing in a year's time? What other chores might he be doing in Honolulu, Japan, China, and Ceylon? All places where colonial England had quite a few diplomatic interests. He continued his experiments throughout all those travels in 1901. His master had not told him to what they would ultimately lead. In Ceylon, he found Frater I.A. Allen Bennett, with whom he went to Kandy. That's a city, okay, where they took a bungalow named Marlborough, overlooking the lake. I.A. had himself been developing on similar lines under P. Ramanan Athan, the Solicitor General of Ceylon, known to occultists under the name Sri Parananda. I.A. told him that in order to concentrate, he must first see that no interruptions reached him from the body, and counseled the adoption of an asana, a settled position in which all bodily movements was to be suppressed. Further, he was to practice pranayama, or control of breathing, which has a similar effect in reducing the lowest possible point to the lowest possible point the internal movements of the body. During the months of his stay at Kandy, he practiced these, obtained success in asana, the intense pain of the practice being overcome, and changed into an indescribable sense of physical well-being and comfort. While in pranayama, he passed through the first stage, which is marked by profuse perspiration of a peculiar kind. The second, which is accompanied by rigidity of the body, and the third, in which the body unconsciously hops about the floor, without in any way disturbing the asana. Now I got to digress for a second here. This is around 1900, okay? There weren't volumes and volumes and volumes at your local library of yoga, yoga for health, also any yoga. There was no pranayama exercises. There weren't any hatha yoga exercises. There weren't any stretches. There weren't any morning salutation. You didn't find out about any of this stuff. Okay. That stuff wasn't there yet. This was new, exotic, old, and esoteric stuff for Crowley. So when we look with today's eyes on what Crowley says about any of the various practices of and disciplines of Eastern mysticism, and go, oh God, Crowley was just, that was so funky. He was such a funky yogi. He was such a funky meditator. He may have been funky, but it was the only freaking game in town, and he was giving it his best shot. During the latter part of August, the whole of September, his practices became continuous, day by day and night, in order to create a rhythm in the mind similar to that which pranayama produces in the body. He adopted a mantra, or sacred sentence, by the constant repetition of which it became automatic in his brain, so that it would continue through sleep, and he would wake up actually repeating the words. Sleep itself, too, was broken up into short periods of very light sleep of a peculiar kind, in which consciousness is hardly lost, although the body obtains perfect rest. Let me digress for a second, because that's what I was lucky enough to be able to do for months at a time during my first 2 years of life. Because of my physical incapacity, I was returned to my crib to lay flat on my back 24 hours a day, except to be carried into the bathroom and things like that. And I didn't sleep through the night. I slept about every other 20 minutes for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 24 hours a day. There was seldom any kind of demarcation between waking and dream consciousness during a period of time where I had very little external stimulation to distract me from processing my infantile pre-linguistic thought patterns. It was pretty groovy. Okay. These practices continued through October, at the beginning of which he reached a state of dhyana, a tremendous spiritual experience in which the subject and the object of meditation unite with excessive violence in a blinding brilliance and music of a kind to which earthly harmony affords no parallel. The result of this, however, was to cause so intense a satisfaction with his progress that he gave up work. He then visited Anuradhapura. It's pronounced just like that. Of the buried cities of Ceylon. In November, he went to India, and in January, he visited IA at Akyab in Burma, where that adept was living in a monastery, with the intention of preparing himself to take the yellow robe of a Buddhist Sangha. And if you don't know it already, Alan Bennett, as a Buddhist Sangha, became a world famous Western Buddhist. As a matter of fact, the first. He became a Buddhist saint, if you will. But that's another story. The whole of the summer of 1902 was spent in an expedition to Kogori. That's the mountain K2, arguably the highest mountain in the world, depending on how continental shelves are breathing, in the Himalayas. During the whole of this period, he did very little occult work. In November 1902 found him in Paris, where he stayed off and on until the spring of 1903, when he returned to his house in Scotland. We must now go backwards in time to take up the thread which had run through his whole work, so important as to demand a chapter to itself. And I believe for Sunday school, we'll pick it up with chapter 4, the sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage, the birth of Frater, and then he doesn't give. Just a blank line. He's not giving the name he took when he was 5 = 6, and now he says AA. For Sunday school tomorrow. Have a great Saturday, everyone. It is still sunny here in Sacramento, but we're in for another atmospheric river. I think it's the 12th one in a row, just within days of each other. So I might not have the sunny light coming through the Venetian blinds tomorrow, but we'll see. Until tomorrow, continue to be good to yourself, be good to each other. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will.